Okay, so I think it's about the time, so we're gonna get started. So hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our panel discussion, Between Worlds, the independent path of Diasporic artists. My name is Diasa, I'm the curator at SICA Vancouver. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's a privilege to be here, and we honor the enduring presence and resilience of these communities. So today we have the great pleasure to invite two outstanding artists and very respectful individuals as well, James Jian and Yan Jadi, to explore the rich and diverse journey of being diasporic artists. Unfortunately, we're planning to them to have another panelist. Her name is Makiko Hara. She's a great independent curator as well. But unfortunately, she can't join us today due to unforeseen reasons. However, I will represent her to share some of her invaluable insights into our conversations. So I will start by briefly introducing most of the panelists. James Jian, who is also the artist for this exhibition catalog. Was born in Taiwan in 1979 and attended the School of Visual Arts in New York, graduating with the BFA in 2001. He's a multidisciplinary visual artist whose work explores imagination and reality through narrative-driven layered compositions. James Jian's focus is multifaceted studio practice on using contemporary subjects with aesthetics techniques from such diverse sources, such as traditional Chinese scroll paintings, Japanese woodblock prints, Renaissance portraiture, West African masquerade, comic books, and psychedelics. His recent collaborations of note include work with Prada, Fuji Yamamoto, and Darren Aronofsky. For Cinephiles, Jane is also the creative hand behind the poster of Oscar-winning movies such as Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Shape of Water, The Whale, and Pinocchio. Jane's work formed part of the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, Lotte Art Museum in Seoul, Korea, and the collection Solo in Madrid, Spain. And Yan Jadi is a Vancouver-based artist, a professor in the Olding Faculty of Art, and currently serving as the interim vice president academic at Harvard University of Art and Design. She was born in Jakarta, Indonesia, and spent years moving between multiple educational, political, and cultural systems. Through drawings, printmaking, and animation, she uses modes of fiction and storytelling to present interrelated and conflicting histories of places. Diane received a BFA from the Cooper Union in New York and an MFA from Concordia University in Montreal. She has exhibited widely at galleries and film festivals across Canada and beyond. Her public art projects include Hush, an animation commissioned by Emily Carr University for the City of Vancouver Public Art Program, Non-Ziri, Commute, commissioned by the Contemporary Art Gallery in partnership with Translink BC, and more. In 2021, Diane was the recipient of the Viva Award from the Jack and Doris Chabot Foundation. So thank you so much for both of you being here with us today. So now I've talked a lot. Let's move on to this exciting discussion with our panelists who are ready to share their experience and reflections on living and creating between cultures. So I know, James, you started as a illustrator and commercial artist, drawing covers for comic books and have taken on many commissioned projects in your own years. At the same time, you are also focusing on your own studio practices of being able to create authentic works that's been exhibited in museums around the world. So James, how would you like to share more about your experience and how did you find a unique positioning in between the fine art and your fine art and commercial art practices?
Sure, I think I'm still trying to find my path. I had to find a more independent path. I became an illustrator more out of necessity in the beginning. I think my intention was to get some side gigs doing book covers and magazine illustrations when magazines existed. And then I could focus on my painting. Unfortunately, I got rejected from all the publishers, and I fell into comics almost by accident. Um, I loved comics growing up and in art school, but I also was really interested in becoming a painter. So as almost a last resort, my friend brought me to DC Comics and actually showed the art director my sketchbook, and that landed me a gig doing monthly covers for DC Comics. And without intending to, I actually became really well known for doing comic book covers. So I did that for about 6 or 7 years. And then after a certain while of developing, I guess, a certain momentum and reputation, I was able to kind of semi-retire from illustration and focus on the painting. But I realized that I was always interested in interpreting text, especially working on those comic covers and also book covers. And I did eventually start doing more editorial illustrations. I would always, have to read the text and kind of be inspired by, visual cues or ideas inside the text to inform the image. And that, I think, still sticks with me to this day. And when I'm making my paintings, I do a lot of research, and I'm always inspired by, the variety of materials that I unearth in my search for an image. So that's where the focus on narrative comes from. So along the way, really, it was just about survival. And, I still faced a lot of rejection to this day, and I've sort of found my own path because I wasn't able to kind of go through certain established networks. So I sort of like found my own niche. I found my own kind of printmaking practice, which kind of supports everything else that I'm doing. And then now I'm doing a lot of museum shows, which I never thought I'd be able to do. And that started in 2019. And now since I've done, I'm opening the 4th museum show in China this weekend. And that's why we're having the panel today on Thursday, because originally we were going to have it on Friday, but I couldn't fly to Beijing in time to make the opening. So thanks for bearing with me and rescheduling. And yeah, so that's how I find myself in this position now through kind of navigating around the sort of, prescribed path that most other artists take.
And I know that you have worked with Prada, you have worked with Johnny Walker. How does these kind of commercial or commission projects looks like to you? Are you able to be fully supportive in terms of your artistic creation, or how do you see them? How do you work around it?
Obviously, when you're working on these large commercial projects, you have to deal with the agency and art direction, and there's certain parameters you have to kind of abide by. Especially dealing with alcohol, there's a lot of regulations you need to follow. And working with fashion, with fashion is much easier because I'm able to just provide my artwork and then let the designer kind of do whatever they want with it. And with these larger brands, like a car company or a liquor company, there is a little bit of convergence there because they end up being the sponsors for the museum shows. So a lot of these shows can't happen without sponsorship, as you know. And I also take that image and I ask for permission to make my own prints from that image. So I'm able to kind of engage my collectors that way. So it's not only just on the bottle, but I'm able to kind of take that image, kind of remove it from that context and kind of turn into more of a personal work. Yeah, I think there are artists who might not want to mix commercial and art, but again, I'm just excited really to, I think, solve a problem and a need and kind of use that as the basis for being creative. And yeah, that came from kind of having to interpret text from my early days, and it's a very similar kind of problem solving kind of approach to my my work.
Thank you for sharing. It's very interesting, and this actually came to the point that you mentioned about different differences between the commercial art world and the fine art world. It actually comes up a lot during our conversation with Kiko Hara, and the point she's been making some very interesting point that for example, Takashi Murakami, he is an artist, kind of institutionalized the comic or to say commercial art, and there's not that much of a clear boundary in Japan, and especially with the super fashion movement, there's not so much of a clear boundary between the fine art and commercial art. So I guess I have a question for you, Dean. I believe a lot of students from Emily Carr will face a very similar situation or opportunities. How would you, do you see a lot of students having, they face the same situation, or how do they usually navigate?
Yeah, I don't think I can speak on behalf of students, but I can speak a bit more about kind of the context that we're in and how that might impact your decision making leaving school. I mean, we all know Vancouver is a very expensive city. We all know, there's not that many galleries in Vancouver. We know that funding is going down nationally. And we're lucky we still have a funding structure that is provincial and national, which doesn't exist in a lot of places. But I think the trick is always, I really appreciated what you said, James, about kind of like you did what you needed to do for survival to kind of figure out a way to make it work, because I think that's what many of us do. I got into teaching kind of by accident for that reason as well. I was an international student. I was offered a job to be a printmaking technician that allowed me to stay in the States, that allowed me to try and get shows. My visa ran out in the States. I went back to school, came to Canada, got a teaching job that allowed me to stay in North America. So sort of these decisions, although I'm very committed to education, was not necessarily like the path I was going towards. I sort of ended up there because I was trying to figure out how do I support myself as an artist. And so I think that, I'm thinking of a quote, I think it's from Andy Warhol, about good business being the best art. And not that, I think it's really important to note that everything that we do have to consider its cost, right? Whether it's a material cost, environmental cost, how we're going to survive in relation to that. Like, I don't buy into the myth of the starving artist. What that looks like in terms of how we fund it can differ. Some people go into teaching, some people do some business that's totally outside of art, and there's in the space, some people find an artistic avenue. It's kind of trying to find that balance, because it's a very small percentage of folks who can make a living out of just making paintings, right? And so I think it's kind of being pragmatic about what are the ways that you support what you want to do in a way that doesn't compromise whatever your ethical standpoint is, and allows you to kind of contribute in different ways. And I think also, like, I'm less concerned about the distinction between commercial and fine art and things like that. But I think it's more about what are the different avenues that you want to communicate with people, and what are the languages you choose to communicate with in those different avenues.
Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, the conversation of starting artists always comes up in the field. And so quoting Makiko's point here, how do you find institutions, grants, and education systems to find and differentiate the two? Because I know the grant system in Canada and the US might be very different, and the art scene in the commercial field might be very different as well. So I wanted to kind of, if you like to share, how do you find that different in those countries?
Shall I go? Well, I'm definitely not familiar with a granting system because, being an American, you're kind of thrust into being, like a consumer capitalist, no matter what. And, it's interesting that you brought up, super flat and being able to appeal to an audience because, for me, I guess I've always wanted to reach a broad audience. And I find that, those commercial collaborations, really reach that audience, especially with the movie posters and fashion and everything else. It kind of, when my friends and family, see those projects come alive, it kind of, they react in a different way. It feels they sense that the art is somehow more tactile, because the white box museum space still seems a little aloof. And with the museum, their mission is to interface with the public, and they want to get a lot of people through the door. So there's this kind of maybe inefficiency or mismatch when maybe the art on the walls is at a high level, but then might require more knowledge about art history in order to kind of fully appreciate it. So while my work, I realize, is more has more of a mass appeal. So maybe that's why I've been able to kind of get into more of the institutions, especially in Asia, because the museums do want to kind of alternate the programming between an artist who has a more I would say um, maybe not conservative is not the right word, but more like art world facing aesthetic, as opposed to mine, which is definitely appeals to a larger audience. So they like to achieve that kind of contrast, I guess, between the programming. And yeah, I think this show is interesting because now after having shown in Asia for so long, I'm finally able to kind of maybe creep back into the Western world, and maybe I'll be able to show in more institutions because of that momentum from Asia and their openness to having an artist like me in a museum. But yeah, not sure what the original question was now, but.
This is very interesting because, as you mentioned, there's more museum shows in Asia, and then you mentioned about super flat movement. I think the Takashi Murakami recently got a new collaboration with Eugene's, and that got his name and Eugene's name both. Their reach is both extended into completely different audience group, and I thought that collaboration is very interesting. And also for a lot of the museums in Asia, they definitely think of accessibility for their people. Because, a lot of people they might not. I would say that most of the people they might not have the fine art history background, and the museum would want to. Because it is something that everyone will be able to come and enjoy it if people got interested and they would dive deeper.
Yes,
So the original question was, how do you find institutions, grants, and education systems define and differentiate commercial and fine art?
yeah, I mean, that's a really big question, but maybe I'll kind of tie it back to the last one in that, I think we often forget that making work requires time and money, right? It's like that time and money are what makes an artistic practice possible in many ways. And so where that time and money comes from can sometimes impact what you can or can't make. And so I think one of the things that can happen in a granting system in a place like Canada and some places in Europe and Australia, for instance, is that you get that time and money from a grant of some sort, which then allows you the space to make work that you don't necessarily have to think of who its audience is or how it's going to sit in the world. And you have a bit more space for kind of that experimental, perhaps, when you know that you don't have to rely on that for your income. But that doesn't mean that you're devoid of the responsibility of thinking of who that audience is, but it just gives you different time and space. Whereas I think when we don't have that, or we don't have access to that, then you have to really think about how am I going to fund this as a practice. That said, I think every avenue of funding will have, its own quirks and its own expectations and its own disciplines and boundaries. And so I think I'm more interested in thinking through like, how does work differ through different types of opportunities? What changes when we can give time and space to somebody, what doesn't? And how do we think about the ways that work can circulate differently and reach different audiences depending on those things?
And so I know, James, a lot of people will be very interested in your experience moving out of school. How do you find the opportunity to work together with the big brands, and how do you get the opportunity to, how do you get started? I think that's, this Ian also mentioned about the point that it is very important to be able to work on larger projects in order to support what that larger project or more of the farmer practices for students. So a lot of people might be interested, how do you start it? How do you get started? And the question for DM would be, for your student, how would you suggest them to get started as they first move out of school?
I think one thing I learned early on was that, no matter what more established artists recommended for me to do, it quickly became obsolete. So my path that I took will not apply. I mean, obviously, during that time, there were newspapers and magazines and album covers, of which I did many. Um, but there were also, other websites where artists would, who didn't have websites of their own, they would post their work on there and, to get more exposure. And there were design blogs. And now we have social media, which is, a vastly different experience. Um, and I feel like I'm becoming obsolete now because I can't do TikTok, with like talking into the camera thing. I'm still like trying to get over that hump. I don't know if I should do that or not, but I hope I never really have to do it. Um, but when I started out, actually a lot of the biggest opportunities came from just word of mouth and people I knew, and I had a lot of support also from the internet because I just would post my work and share it, and I would also share my process very early on. I used to have a blog called Process Recess where I would break down each of my projects and, from sketch and to finish, and I'd even shared some Photoshop files with my layers. And now with AI, that's more important than ever to kind of, show the human touch in the work because it's, you can't tell these days, when you're looking at a AI generated image. Yeah, that part of the process is super important and helps tell the story of, your own practice. And that really helped my work gain traction online. Very early on, I did avoid working with managers and agents, and they always gave me the ick when someone would approach me, and I just followed my own intuition. Um, Even to this day, when I work with, you know, other people, and right now I have various teams of people helping me, they still remark that, they're surprised I don't have a studio manager. I mean, I still oversee everything, and maybe because I'm a Virgo, I want everything to kind of go a certain way. But I do have a lot of people help me. I don't do all this alone, but it is like very top down rather than having, a manager kind of oversee you and almost control you. I think being an artist, it's very important to, be sovereign and be independent, because you can get taken advantage of very easily. Um,
Do you ever work with a gallery before, or do you?
yeah, I worked with Kai Kai Kiki for a little bit, for about a year and a half, and then I think we both decided to amicably split ways because nothing was happening. I was still doing all my commissions and own work, and I think, Takashi wasn't really bringing any new opportunities, and so decided, okay, let's just, end this.
It's a big decision to avoid Kamakiki because Takashi Murakami is a big brand. He himself is already quite established. Artist and Kamakiki is very well established gallery.
Sure, I wasn't, so recently I spent some time with Yoshito Monara, and actually the past 3 years, we've hung out in Japan, and he has I think, the ideal path in that, he has no assistance. He just works on his own. He still stretches his own canvas and he lives in the countryside. And he's kind of not beholden to, having a high overhead. Like Takashi, he's got hundreds of mouths to feed, hence all the merchandise and commercial collaborations. And I mean, honestly, he likes that. He likes that pressure. He always likes his back against the wall, as he says. Whereas, Nara is, I mean, recently he said, yeah, I don't worry about deadlines. And, he pointed at these paintings on the wall and he said, oh, these are my favorite paintings I've done recently. And, it only took me 20 minutes, but actually he said, it took me 2 weeks of waiting until I could execute them in those 20 minutes. So yeah, they are both friends, same generation. They took very different paths. Yeah, for me, I think I always just liked my independence. And, I also saw, friends with some of the other Kaikai Kiki artists. And, there is a lot of obligation there. And, yeah, I think, with the Kaikai Kiki organization, it is also very top down. Everything, it's very Yakuza-like. But I think for me, that there can only be one person on the top of the hierarchy, so maybe that it wouldn't work out.
Thank you, that's very interesting.
Can you reframe the question again?
So the question is, we're talking about James' experience and how would you advise your students when they first come out of school, what would be their first step to take to establish an industry?
Thank you. And thank you, James, for saying you feel obsolete, because I do as well. And I say that quite seriously in that I started in a very different economic climate. It was the 90s, it was the US, there was recession, rent was cheap. I was living in New York with rent, it was like $600 a month, and that was like shared with one other person. So that allows for options, right? And so I think I always go back to these economics because I think it does determine how you want to navigate. But I think the most important thing that I learned from that time period was kind of being open to possibilities. So I've always been somebody where when an opportunity kind of shows itself, I kind of go like, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And then kind of see where it goes. To be okay with rejection, it's like, because rejection will happen forever. Like, yes, I think we all still get rejected from applications.
I got rejected today.
Yeah, it's like, and that's just an ongoing thing, right? It's like, and so kind of getting comfortable with, seeing an opportunity, trying for it. If it doesn't work out, then it's just not meant to be for that time. Try again another time. And I think, you do sort of start to build a path through that, and so in my own path, like when I was first out of school, I became involved in collectives, for instance, because that was a way to kind of meet people outside of my kind of immediate community. I gained so much from like the mentorship of the very different kind of generations of folks that were in the collectives I was part of. And then we learned also how to kind of self-organize for exhibitions, and that gave me some skills that may not have kind of been apparent at that time, but that I still draw upon now in terms of thinking through like, how do we get something done? How do we kind of come together to make something happen? And so I think the main thing is like that openness, that willingness to just put things out there. It's a lot of work to put together an application for anything, I know that. So once you have one, send it to a lot of places. And then when rejection comes back, you're like, okay, well, maybe I'm not ready for that one. Let's try something else. And then just kind of, if you keep going to one body of kind of applications and that doesn't work out, then maybe there's a different kind of group of things to try out for. And it's just that kind of, that sense that I think what's important is like, to sustain a practice, we have to know that there's going to be some ebbs and flows. There's going to be some years where everything works out really well. Then there's some years like, oh my God, no one likes my work. Am I ever going to show again? And it's just like, and then you just have to kind of go through that over time. And then you sort of build that then you kind of build that confidence in bodies of work that allow you to then kind of keep going forward. But it's a lot of persistence and openness.
Interesting. I find it really interesting that being an artist, the important part is being able to rejection and then when I was in university, we do have critique class that we bring out our paintings and then critique on each other's works and that really actually brings lots of inspiration to me. The way people see it, different perspectives and different considerations they're taking in instead of just I created the artwork, I have an explanation for it, but most of the time it's how the other people see it, how that fit into the theme or how that fit into the context. And then coming back to this exhibition, James, I know that you utilize visual motif that bring together logical, folkloric narratives from both the West and Asian context. So fostering a fusion of representative diverse audience, and when explaining because we created very special typography for the metalwork, the words metalwork, and then also the same word that we used for this exhibition. You mentioned that you wanted to create some custom typography for the show that would be very legible, alluding to the idea of the loss of language, of the struggle to decipher for symbols and to communicate. So for both James and Deanne, if your diasporic background, how do you navigate and use cultural references, and how do you capitalize on your cultural heritage and history?
Well, when I was in art school, I fell in love with traditional oil painting, so my work was very Western facing. My teacher during school was Stephen Essel, and I loved painters in New York like there was Vincent Desiderio, Odd Nairdrum, Eric Fischel, David Sally, all these, I would say, yeah, very Western type of painting. But over the years, I just, for whatever reason, became naturally drawn to, Eastern art, Asian art. And I went to China for the first time in 2001 for this trip called the China Synergy Program. And it's basically this free trip in China, but you had to apply. And they invited all these students from prestigious universities all over the world, but I was the only artist. And they took us on a 3-week trip through China. And being around all those other ethnically Chinese students, I'd never been around so many Asian people in my life, and it kind of boosted my confidence in a way. Even though I couldn't speak Mandarin, my Chinese is terrible, still terrible, and it's this big regret that I carry to this day that I don't speak better Chinese. And that informs the work now. That feeling of kind of not fully belonging to any culture, always feeling like kind of on the margins of, American society, but then not being able to fully integrate into, Taiwan or China. And so that feeling of in-betweenness led to, the creation of some of my characters and the feelings that I hope my paintings evoke. And that's why I designed the title this way, because I wanted the meaning of the word kind of divorced from the way it sounds. So, I don't know if any of you heard the phrase cellar door. Some people say it's the most beautiful sounding phrase in the English language, according to some writers, J.R.R. Tolkien for one. And for some reason, when I was making the work for the show, metal art just kept on, recurring in my mind. And I was like, I don't know what it means. Actually, it's quite nice that it doesn't have a specific connotation to it. And I just like the way it sounds. And because, I'm just focused on the aesthetics of its phonetics, then it's almost like painting, which is, a place, a zone away from the world of words and semantics, which can be, quite limiting and also, create a lot of conflict. So that's why painting and drawing is sort of my safe space, I guess, because it's away from those limitations. And yeah, so that's how I've dealt with being a diasporic artist.
And I guess I like your phrase "in between this" because I think, for me, having been born in Jakarta and growing up in it's a mixed race family, but very strong Indonesian cultural context. My mother studies textiles, so I grew up with a lot of kind of Indonesian cultural references in the home, textiles, stories, etc. And so going to college in New York City for fine arts, the only reference to Asian art at that time was basically 1,000 years old. And so, for me, it was a way of trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to, if I know there's a very contemporary culture, I know there's this history, but in this current place, it's at that moment it was not talked about as if it was current. And so, for me, referring to these various elements in my own practice, which in all ways always have something to do with Indonesia, is a way to kind of a reminder of its presence and a reminder of its contemporaneity. I cannot say that word ever. And a way to kind of think through history through kind of visual language. So like, for instance, like I'm really interested in ceramic patterns because Indonesia is an archipelago and it's had a lot of trade with various cultures since, for many millennia. And so some of the ceramic patterns that we see that are Chinese that kind of make their way, for instance, to textiles that are in Indonesia that then make their way to kind of other forms. So for me, it's like trying to understand how all these things connect is how I use these patterns. And I think when I first started showing my work back in the 90s, it was often always within the context of like it was an Asian American show, or it was a gender show, or it was a queer show. Like those were at that time often the only places where works that looked like this were kind of understood. And so it's exciting to kind of be in a place where that's breaking apart more, but I think it hasn't broken apart enough. But that idea that I think, there's different aesthetic traditions that live across the world and they all kind of function in different ways. But I think in North America, in much of the gallery system, there's still that sense of like Western art history and then other stuff.
And then when you were choosing your visual motif, is there something that it shows repetitively over time and that you find has a very special meaning to you?
Probably one motif I use a lot is this cloud form that I also have tattooed on my arm. And it's a batik cloth pattern from Cirebon. And Cirebon is the town on the north coast of Java that my dad's from. And I love the pattern visually. It's kind of, it's always a gradation of tones from like a dark, not always a blue, but it's like from a dark in the center to a light at the edge. And in that town, it's kind of seen as symbolic of this place, Cirebon in Java. But if you look at the pattern, it's, you see it on Chinese vases and textiles, you see it in Japanese vases and textiles. And Cirebon itself has a long history of Chinese and Middle Eastern presence in that town. And so for me, like, that's an image I use a lot because I see it as like something that represents one place actually represents its whole history of places, and I find that really fascinating in thinking about it. But I also really like the motif of a cloud because it's a way to kind of think through, like, when we start to look at the atmosphere in the sky, it's hard to place it, and so it's easier for me to kind of think of it as referring to lots of different landscapes because it's kind of outside of our normal landscape.
And James, we have lots of visual motifs.
You say motif here or motif? I guess motif. Yeah, in my advanced stage, I still mispronounce a lot of words. But yeah, there are a whole range of different recurring visual ideas in my work. I would say, the maze is one recurring one. So, there's the maze on the back of the the foot, the slingshot sculpture over there, and there's I think a couple of mazes hidden in some of the paintings. Yeah, there's butterflies, there's various creatures. I don't like to adhere to one thing. I think, a lot of people say that, an artist kind of should develop one strong idea and kind of beat it to death. And I guess that does work. But I think for me, it's interesting because, with each of my paintings, each painting has a very distinct composition and narrative. And I think that's why my prints continue to do well, because each image is so different from the other. And when I started out, I think that was actually a disadvantage, because some of the feedback I got was, people had a hard time kind of pinning me down into a category or into the type of work I was doing, or to find like my signature element. And yeah, that was a struggle for a very long time. And yeah, now I think it's only started to make sense after, now it's like 20 years or so of developing the work. When people have started to, recognize the recurring patterns. But yeah, I don't want to be locked in to doing a specific thing over and over again. But yeah, I understand when that does happen to other artists. Maybe they're happy to do that. I know I couldn't do it.
Interesting. And then I know that this conversation came up between us a lot before. Again, as you mentioned earlier, there are growing amount of international students at American University, and how it might be a little difficult for them to navigate through their cultural background and start to be able to knowledge the country background, and then start to kind of forming their own style and being able to use it as something that they want to show in their painting. So, what would your suggestion be for the students, for these young generations of diasporic artists?
I feel like there's a lot of responsibility in that question. I'm nervous answering it. I think, and I feel like it makes me nervous because it's a bit of a double-edged sword, in the sense that, often if you're minoritized in any way, there's an expectation that you talk about your history. There's an expectation that you bear yourself in some way. And often what I say to students is you don't have to share what you don't want to share. It's like that's entirely up to you. And I think all of us work from our histories, but there's some histories that are considered neutral and accepted as the norm, and then other histories that are considered as kind of somehow unique or exoticized. And so I think it's a tricky place because even for me, it took me years to feel comfortable with using very specific direct references to Indonesia, because when I did, I felt like we'd be exoticized quite easily. Everyone would be like, oh, that looks exactly like a Hawaiian figure, or and then kind of go into their narratives about what they thought that meant. And so it's always this kind of delicate balance of, this is my history, and this is the kind of the cultural context that I come from. And so I'm trying to kind of understand that cultural context, but to present it in a way that hopefully doesn't allow someone to just assume a stereotype about it. And I think that's always a tricky piece. But I think for any of us, it's just trying to, I feel like making work is trying to figure out the stories that you want to tell. And each project that I do usually starts with a question of why is this like that? Or what is this, why does this picture look the way it does? Or why does this thing do that? And I think we all have those questions, whatever that is. And what excites me about where we are now, or at least in Vancouver, is that, there are so many different types of folks around that there is much more of a diverse vocabulary of visual matter than there was when I was in school 30 years ago. And so hopefully that means there's more openness to try different things without it being kind of pigeonholed as a particular language. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I think it's like, it's a weird space because I do feel like, a lot of students come to me and say like, I don't want to talk about my background. I'm like, well, don't. You don't have to. And I think that's the challenge always.
Yeah, I think it's important to just follow your intuition and maybe not intellectualize it too much. I think for me, I always try not to overthink it in the beginning. I just kind of just dive into it. And it's only after the work is created where you can decipher the symbols and kind of understand it in a different lens. And I always felt like the strongest work always came from that approach, where you try not to be too self-aware, because that always kind of blocks whatever it is that's inside of you, blocks the inspiration, blocks, the divine kind of, energy that's coursing through you. You have to just let that flow through you. And, all those questions about, your culture, politics, all those things will emanate in the work, will be there, will be inherent in the work. But I believe in, at least in my creative uh, approach, that you should just, I call it no mind, just very zen, I guess.
If I can just add one thing, I think the other thing that I do like to think about though is again to kind of go to audience, like who are we speaking to in the work? And so, like sometimes when I'm making work, I think, like if this work is seen by this person who knows this history, they might get one thing, but a person who doesn't know this history might get another thing. And so for me, it's like that my stories are never that evident because there'll be kind of multiple stories layered. And I really appreciate what you said about kind of the studio process, because I do think, I think there's always this kind of funny space about being in school. You're asked to kind of talk about the work as you're making the work, and often that's not actually the most productive thing. And I rarely know what my work is about until it's complete. But I've been working long enough that I've built up kind of a vocabulary to work with. But if you ask me to talk about what I'm working in the studio right now, I'm going to be, I don't know, it's like doing some stuff. But if you ask me what do I did 10 years ago, I can be really articulate about it. So I think you do have to give yourself the space to play and explore in the studio and kind of allow for what happens there and then reflect afterwards.
Yeah, it takes time. I think everyone wants results really quickly, and then they feel really insecure when they're not birthed as like a fully formed artist. So yeah, it does take time. As you said, building up your visual vocabulary and then like library of images that you can draw from. Yeah, that takes time.
I think looking back James, looking back in your earlier painting, they're very much oil painting that you can tell like a very strong Western oil painting influence. But then does the Chinese image program change that? Is it something that inspired you to be something different after that?
I think I was already kind of moving towards more of like a linear approach. Around the same time, I discovered the work of Giuseppe Castiglione in Taiwan, and he's an interesting character in history because he was a Italian Jesuit missionary that went to China during the Qing Dynasty, and he brought over his Western painting techniques into traditional Chinese silk scroll painting, and has a very I would say pleasing kind of mix of styles. I mean, I think now you see a lot of his work on like, might be considered a little cheesy, but at the time, when I looked at it, I was really blown away because, it was this interesting hybrid of approaches where like there was that flatness, but then also the way things were rendered were very, had a very atmospheric or Western type of approach. And yeah, that really inspired me to kind of, move forward with what I was doing with more confidence.
Thank you for sharing. That's very interesting. So moving along, I think a lot of people want to know your entrepreneurship in the art world, and
If you are able to give suggestion or advice to art students, how can they practice arts / cultural entrepreneurship in their field?
Well, I think there's many more options and pathways now, especially, like say with Squarespace, you can set up your own web store very easily. When I started out, that was a very, very difficult thing to do. And, now I think we all realize social media is really important for artists, of all different levels. Um, and, in terms of entrepreneurship, very early on, I tried to diversify and had different levels of collecting for my work. So, there was the prints, and then there's the drawings, and then paintings, and then, now there's more sculptures. And I didn't shy away from the commerce side because, I did want to, survive and, kind of, I still had this fear of failing and starving. So, I'm always like saving for the future and kind of preparing for that. But I think there is a lot of competition now because of how, accessible all these tools are. I don't know if I have any great advice, but, for me, a lot of people said I shouldn't do certain things. One other artist, when I was in Juxtapose magazine, this other artist said, "Oh, you're never going to make it in the fine art world," and he really, he was an illustrator trying to be a painter, and he tried to make inroads, and I think, he wound up, returning back to illustration, because he said no to a lot of things because he had this, prescribed idea of how an artist was supposed to be. And, there's this other artist I know who, he was a fantastic illustrator, and he got a master's degree and, kind of went completely in the opposite direction. And then now, he's a great painter, but now facing a lot of struggles when maybe if he embraced his natural gifts, then he might be more established or independent. I think for me, I always just embraced my natural gifts. In school, it's also important to unlearn a lot of the things that you're told. Like I had mentioned before, very quickly, the prescribed path becomes obsolete. So, it's always difficult for me to give advice because, as soon as I give it, it might not apply, and I hope it doesn't lead someone the wrong way. So I think it's very important to kind of be adaptive and react to the situation on the ground, and to not say no because you think someone's going to look down on you or they think it's not the correct way to do things. I have always kind of just done things my own way because I felt like it was right for me. And hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. In the end, do you have any suggestions or advice for the students?
I think the only thing I'll add to what Jane said is that, although this sounds cliche, I think it's quite true that everyone's path is different, and that timeline looks different for everybody. And I think to go back to what you said earlier about how rushed it feels right now to get everything through, it's like to have a sustained practice. It's like you have to be okay with some things taking a longer time. And so I think in that interim, figuring out how to support yourself is important. But it's that, that path is going to be different for everybody. I know folks who went to art school, didn't do anything artistic, so to speak, for like 20 years, and now are really established after that because they started making work again at that time when it felt right. I know people who got super famous within like a year out of art school, and now they're not making art anymore for various reasons. So it's like you just don't know what that right way is, and it's different for everybody.
I don't envy young artists now because there's that pressure to be fully polished and formed with social media. Yeah, it's horrible. I mean, it's got to be, I don't know, what's the word, regulated or something. You know, they need to, like, before you're 18, you're not allowed to have social media. I don't know. I kind of think that's going to have to be the case. You know, the same with, you know, Johnny Walker or whatever. You got to set a limit.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. It gets young artists more opportunities, but at the same time, there's even more competition and there's
Yeah, it's an unrealistic pressure, you know, to be like a fully formed artist and have everyone look at you and judge you, and to feel like you have to put yourself out there even though you're not ready. You know, it's very tough.
Yeah, and James, I'm very curious. I know you're a super hardworking artist, and you're both artist and as well as an educator. I'm really curious about your daily routine. When do you go to the studio? How long do you spend in the studio? And how does your day look like?
Well, when I'm in Los Angeles, it's very regimented because, you know, I have a son and I take him to school in the morning, and then I go to the studio and basically work until around 3 or 2:40 actually exactly. And then I have to go pick him up, go back to the studio, then we have dinner, and then, you know, I walk the dog. Actually, I walk the dog in the morning too, and then I put him to bed, and then yeah, I work again from around 9 to 10:30. So that's what it's been like for the past few years. Although when I was younger, I would not sleep much. I did work maybe way more than was healthy. And you know, now that in my mid-40s, I am really trying to stay healthy and not get hurt or develop, you know, a debilitating disease. So I am trying to get enough sleep, and that schedule and actually having the family is really helpful in like maintaining that schedule and focus. Definitely a lot different than Nara. You know, he's very free, and but that structure allows me to kind of be very productive.
And in terms of the way they split your time, how much percentage of the time that you are able to focus on painting and versus more of the administrative or like organizational kind of tasks?
Yeah, I try to do all the administrative stuff like the first hour of the day. But and you know, this is something I see with a lot of artists. You know, we're always on our phones, and you know, there's because I work with various teams of people. There's just always messages, and like sometimes something will pop in my head, and then I'll just send out a message, and you know, people will, you know, move around. You know, it's just like commanding you know, a small army, I guess. But yeah, yeah, the phone's actually, and because I work with China, so actually I do work like almost 24 hours because like I work on Asia time too. So yeah, it's just a lot of texting and looking at images and, you know, emails.
That's impressive.
Yeah, and then painting at the same time. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either, but somehow things get done.
So in the past 3 years, I've been doing more administrative work at university, which means that I work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So that's really shifted my studio time. So when I was teaching, it's like you have a few days of teaching, you have a day of like administrative work for teaching, kind of duties and all of that. And then I'd have 3 more days left. So usually those 3 days I'd spend like 1 to 2 in the studio and then 1 kind of at home. So now with working 9 to 5, it is really quite, it is more intense to try and kind of figure out that balance. So right now I try and get 1 day in the studio for the weekend, but it's kind of that thing of like, okay, with 2 weekend days, what day do I do my errands? What day do I rest? What day do I see my friends? And what day do I do the studio? So it's you know, I'm still kind of trying to find that balance with this kind of schedule. But it does, I mean, I think the advice that I received at school, like always treat this as a job, like the art practice as a job is really valuable because no matter what, I try and do it, even if it's only an hour that I committed for the week. I will go for that hour to do that bit and then try and make it up another time. And when I do have an exhibition, it means that yes, I'm going to be coming home from work, go to the studio after that, go to the studio on the weekends, so it's an uneven schedule because of that. But it's about, I guess, just kind of committing to it. So I know at this point in time, with the work I have now, it's going to be less hours. I know I have some exhibitions coming up, so I'll have to kind of adjust my schedule. I have to plan really, really well. So it's like if I have an exhibition next year, I have to start really parceling out my time after kind of like 5 p.m. days and weekends to kind of make sure that everything happens. I don't have the luxury of just kind of assuming it's all going to get done at this point. But to me, it's still like going to the studio is also my mental health. It's like I go there, I decompress, I draw. My drawing is very meditative. It helps me kind of rebalance, and so that also pushes me to be able to kind of keep that as a practice.
Yeah, so when a lot of people think of working as an artist, they thought, oh, it's a job, but full of freedom, and it's very chill, easy, and relaxed. But it's actually not. Misconception.
Yeah, it really asks a lot, like all of you, I think, at least for me, I'm fully devoted to it.
Yeah, so thank you. We're about at the time. Thank you so much for sharing today. And we do have half an hour left, and I know everyone sitting here might have a lot of questions for both of them. So I would love to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions? We have to raise some hands. Oh. Yeah, we have another gentleman over there. Sorry? We have another gentleman. Oh, okay. But you go first. Okay. Yeah.
This is a question for Dave. First of all, I want to gush a bit and say that I've been a fan for years, especially your sketchbooks and films. But I'm actually kind of curious because it's wonderful to see how your appreciation for you is growing. Every time I come upon a movie poster, I'm like, wow, I recognize my way. And they're really interesting directors, like completely different visionaries. Taro, Aronofsky. What's your experience working with these completely different type of directors?
Sure, yeah. So actually, I didn't work directly with Denis because that was through Warner Brothers, but with Darren and Guillermo, those guys I worked directly with, and we were like, closely communicating, and they're very, very different. So Guillermo, I'd met years ago, and I designed a logo for his production company, and that's how we got acquainted. And yeah, he gave me like complete freedom. Like he just wrote like a little prompt, I guess, and I just went off. But with Darren, it was like we went through like 11 rounds of sketches for Mother that began with a totally different idea and just a lot of back and forth, and he's very specific. It's funny with these movie posters because I think that was 2017. So Darren asked me to do the poster, and then Guillermo asked me at the same time, and they, of course, they didn't coordinate. And then I think Darren was a little jealous that Guillermo also asked me, and I agreed to do his movie poster. But then, 5 years later, they both asked me again at the same time. So it's just really strange how that worked out. But yeah, to this day, yeah, we have very direct working relationship in terms of the posters. So.
Curious, just going back to your question, your comment about sort of building your practice and your routine. It sounds like you work with a lot of people, right, in your day-to-day life. I'm just curious how you went through that development of working on your own to bringing people on into your practice, into your studio, and how, who you hire first, how do you find people, and how do you develop that practice?
So, I've worked with a few assistants over the years, and they just came through recommendations, usually from other teachers at Art Center. And yeah, they've worked with me for a very long time. As far as the other team, so I have a team in Colorado that does all of my printmaking and web store fulfillment, and they also do some fabrication for me, and all sorts of little things that I need help with. But the great thing is it's its own company, even though they almost exclusively work for create my work. I'm not responsible for the payroll or any of that. So I create the work. They with the profits, they're able to kind of sustain themselves. And then there's like a team in China that produces a lot of my sculptures, and they also produce the museum shows and the brand collaborations also. Again, that's its own company, and we have a very close relationship where they're almost like my satellite studio. And that just happened very organically. It started out just very small projects, and the working relationship was good. Good communication, or our communication styles are simpatico in that we're all workaholics, so we're just texting like all throughout the day, any time of day. And the same with my printmaker. He's just like, he loves making stuff, and he loves taking risks and just trying new things and constantly. It's funny because his son also works at the company, but the son is more about work-life balance. And the son always makes fun of me because he says I don't have work-life balance. But I'm like, well, like your dad, like we just love what we do, and so we're just like full force all hours of the day. And I also worked with Avant Art for a long time and done a lot of projects together. And they've also helped with various things. Even like with gathering data and doing analysis on on the market and all sorts of things. So it's just being able to basically have healthy, productive relationships with various people, and I've just been lucky because over the years I've had these like very long kind of working relationships that started out very modestly, but then kind of grew, and we all kind of have grown together.
So yeah, you spoke earlier. There's a question for James. You spoke earlier about not being categorized into one type of discipline, and having followed your work for a while. I know that you do a wide variety of art practices, mediums, painting, sculptures, and things like that. I wanted to ask specifically about animations. You had shared a series of animations last year. I wanted to ask your experience about how that was, and if you're interested in kind of pursuing that discipline in the future.
Yeah, so the animations I've done in the past few years have been made by Zachary Corzine. I'm not sure if he's here in the room right now, but he's someone that was introduced to me a long time ago, and I was really impressed with his work. Yeah, we just started out with one piece, and that just has continued on. Yeah, I would love to create more motion works in the future. And at one point during COVID, there was a plan to create something a lot more ambitious, but I think that was a time when everyone went a little crazy, and so that kind of blew up. And actually, I developed like a whole treatment and everything. But who knows? Maybe one day that'll return. But my focus is still on the painting. It's just because I have the CG data for the sculptures, I thought, well, it would be really great to kind of like make those sculptures move, and that's sort of the impetus for all the animations that I've done so far. So I love creating characters, and very early on, actually when I was really young, I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I recognized very quickly in art school that I was not a good cartoonist. I was only good at making single images, right? Splash pages or pinups. That was my strength. And so it's the same thing now where like I'm great at the single image and maybe that single character. And so these animations are very brief, and they focus on like kind of a very simple, self-contained moment. I think an overarching narrative and a whole film would be very, very hard and difficult for me. So I'm not sure yet. I would love to do something more ambitious in the future, but for now, like I love creating these kind of vignettes and, almost like moving three-dimensional paintings. So.
The gentleman in black.
Deanne?
Yeah, what you say about I was wondering what you could say about where you think ideas come from, and then also about cultivating relationship with creativity and how you can sustain that process of how do you nourish yourself, how creativity is like a wellspring, how do you keep that wellspring alive and keep it attractive to users?
Thank you for that lovely question.
Very hard question, so
Yeah.
go ahead.
I mean, I think how to keep it alive, but for me, it's really about curiosity and play. Like I'm just like I like to nerd out on things. I have, I see something, I'm curious about it, I follow that path. And I think that curiosity for me is a way to kind of, like I said earlier, I always have this question like, oh, why is that? And then that for me is like what starts to spark questions. And so like when I go to the studio, often the first thing that I do is I'll open up my laptop. I have stacks of postcards that I've collected over the years. I have random objects. I just kind of lay them out. I kind of go on my phone and go to a few kind of sites that I always look at. And then something starts to kind of pop up like, oh, what's this thing? I'll start sketching like a random thing that's, without overthinking it. And usually it's that moment of kind of like going in and out and just looking at things and asking questions that an idea starts to develop. And for me, that part about play is really important. Like, I know I said earlier about the studio being like a space for me for like contemplation, but it's also like, it has to be fun. It's like, I love working with materials. I love making prints. I love making animations. I love all this stuff, And so the studio for me is often like a set of games I play with myself. So while I might have conceptual ideas that I'm working with, I'm also going in and being like, what would happen if I painted this and only used a color I never used before? And so just that each time that I'm going in, I'm trying to do something that I don't necessarily know how to do. And I think to kind of something you were saying earlier about, like some people doing the same thing over and over again, and some people not necessarily doing that. For me, it's always when something gets too easy, that's when I get bored. And so I'm often, if I know how to do something well, that's often when I stop doing it. And I'm like, now what? What if this? What if that? And usually my inspiration in terms of where ideas develop is really I look at a lot of stuff. I'm a very visually oriented person, and sometimes it's something on the news, sometimes it's like a phrase I hear, sometimes I'm just like on the bus and I hear somebody say something like that's a weird phrase, and then I kind of start to visualize it. So there's not necessarily a specific place, but again, it's that openness to the world around and to just observing everything and feeling that everything is worth thinking through and worth considering. And then having fun is really important. It's like I think I take that studio space very seriously as a space where it's about experimentation, it's about play. The production part is really just at the end when it's like I now have an exhibition, I have to finish it. But until that point, it's mess. And it's like a fun, pleasurable mess.
For me, I find that limitations are really important, or having problems to solve are really important, because when you have too much freedom, it can actually be very paralyzing. So, in my more recent work, from the past, 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of the paintings have actually been commissions. And so that parameter actually forces me to be creative. Whereas when I was starting out, I was more focused on my sketchbooks. And actually, we're still exhibiting my sketchbook drawings in the museum shows now. And then that's a really important period of my life where I was just forcing myself to work in my sketchbooks every day and observing the world around me. And actually, the sketchbooks allowed for different approaches. So there was a phase in my sketchbooks where, I would try to work just for imagination and let kind of the real world seep in. And then kind of the pages became too overworked and too elaborate. And so then I wanted to pare everything back and just do pure observational drawings and let whatever was in front of me kind of dictate what would happen on the page. So almost like automatic drawing in a way. So I didn't have to think about it. And the compositions would just sort of, the drawings would overlap and become this like really interesting tangle of lines. And then, I would go back to doing more imaginative drawings. So it was like this back and forth. But always the intention was to force myself, well, not force is a bad word, because I love drawing, but I always had my sketchbook with me. And whenever I would have a meal with a friend or be, on the subway, I'd just be constantly drawing and just be active. Now it's different. Now actually I can't always have my camera with me, and I love photography, so I'm always taking a lot of pictures. And I don't work in my sketchbooks the same way now that I did when I was younger. Now my sketchbooks are more like real sketchbooks, where it's just like, a lot of small thumbnails and ideas and little scribbles. And then, for example, like over the summers, I spend time in Japan, and that's where I developed all the sketches for the next year. And so actually all this work was done last summer. I created all the sketches because my space in Japan is really small, so I can't paint. And then when I come back to LA, then that's when all the drawings are, projected and transferred onto large canvases, and I start the color studies and begin working on the paintings. And this summer is the same. When I was in Japan, I already created, a whole suite of paintings for this next year. And when I'm back in LA, I'm going full force. And, I have that direction because I have this litany of drawings I need to produce and turn to paintings for my commissions. So that's how I've been able to kind of just keep, being productive.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, in the back?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about legacy. Myself, I'm an artist. As I get older, I think of legacy and it's more detrimental as I get older instead of exciting. So I'm just kind of curious if you guys have your own experiences thinking about as you age, there's doubt or things you want to do that you have to give up.
Yeah, I mean, something I constantly think about, but that is a motivating factor in why I'm so productive, is because I don't want to leave anything unexplored. That's why, like, say, with all the different things I've done recently, like with the sculptures and all the new techniques, we're experimenting with my printmaking, and then with the stained glass work that I'm working on right now. I'm trying to construct this huge fused glass dome. This is my, I would say, fourth collaboration with Judson Studios in Pasadena, and the most ambitious one yet. And it's insanely been insanely expensive, and that's a whole other team of people, various teams of people that I'm working with to create this thing. And yeah, a lot of people say I'm completely foolish for spending this amount of money on making this thing, even though there's no place for it, there's no one commissioning it. But I'm thinking, well, I can't take this money with me when I die, and that helps me be more like financially nihilistic and able to just like push this thing forward. And the end is it's been almost 5 years trying to make this thing, and it's going to be an incredible object and totally groundbreaking. Not only the glass, but the frame, engineering wise, it's totally unprecedented. Fused glass wise, also unprecedented. And then when it's together, it's going to be amazing. But it's funny because whenever I post about the dome on my social media, it gets the lowest engagement, right? So it's my biggest, most ambitious project, but nobody cares about it. But we're still moving forward. And actually, I'm really happy that, through all the work that I do, all the, the editions that I sell, that all goes to support a lot of people. So it's like dozens of people, there's architects, engineers, there's artisans, there's scientists even who have worked on this project, material scientists, and it's amazing that our work can kind of like, help, kind of distribute this energy to many different people, and all in the effort to create this singular art object. And again, through this project, I've developed a lot of good long relationships as well. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to do more projects too. So that those thoughts are, that legacy, that thought about leaving that legacy is what kind of propels a lot of the more ambitious projects.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I don't know if I've thought about the legacy in and of itself. I guess there's two things that I might speak about. Like one is I am very conscious about, like I am a middle-aged queer person. And like, what does it mean to be a middle-aged queer person making work? And how do I continue to make that part visible? Because I think that visibility increasingly I find important, especially for young folks. So I think that's one thing, and that's less about the work, but I think I'm more about how I talk about myself and how I talk about my work in relation to queerness. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is just a hope that I am able to continue to be curious, and that I am able to continue to keep the work alive, in the sense, like by alive I mean that it continues to progress in whatever way it progresses, and I don't become stable in what I'm doing. So I don't know if that's about legacy necessarily, but I know just thinking ahead, like that, those are the two things I hope.
Okay, one question over here, and then after that, I'm going to move on to the second floor.
My question is, for both of you, what are your experiences with feeling good enough or not good enough? And how has that transpired in your art journey?
I always feel horrible. So there's a lot of things that still haunt me to this day from, my experiences growing up, as a small Asian boy in New Jersey. So I think what's great is, the paintings are made in solitude, and, they require a lot of kind of despair to get you through it. And, but then the paintings actually, impart a lot of, joy and beauty into the world, and, they create a community around it. Also another end of it is the desire for revenge. So that helps too. That's how I get through the day. So.
I like that desire for revenge. Self-doubt, of course, always creeps in. I think it's always a kind of back and forth. It's like I'm confident in what I can do, and when I'm in the studio and all of that. But of course, anytime you're out in the public, it's always like, it's like I've done public speaking for many years. It still gives me anxiety to the pits of my stomach every time I have to do something like this. So I think that self-doubt is always there, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I think in a way it ensures that I'm always asking myself why I'm doing something. Am I doing it well? It kind of keeps me honest in some ways to have that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as humans, we're actually designed for suffering. We're able to endure a lot. So, maybe especially, looking at my parents, they had a, really difficult time kind of adapting to life in America, and I admire their resilience, and maybe, my dad's entrepreneurship and, you know, all the things he tried to drum into my head actually like seeped in and have, you know, influenced me to this day. But yeah, I always kind of remember that. I mean, suffering is not bad, and it's not something to shy away from. You know, embrace it. You know, we were all born in the dark, right? So.
So being an artist, you have to have both a strong body and a strong mind.
I play a lot of ping pong recently. That actually helps both the body and the mind.
Yeah, so I will take one question from the second floor, and then I will move on because I know that we have a lot of people sending in questions from the live stream. So I would let's do the second floor first. Anyone from the second floor? This gentleman here.
Hi, I was just wondering, I love your just wondering how you go about it. Oh, sorry. I love your work, Jane. I was just wondering, like, your process between the Washington and paintings.
Yeah, so actually at a certain point, the paintings need some chaos introduced to them, and that's when the washes come in. Like I always need to kind of push it back, and then that allows me to kind of, you know, pull things out again. Especially with these more clean, colorful paintings, they end up looking too perfect. So I always do a destructive wash just to make things more difficult for me, and then, but it really does introduce a lot more depth and interest to the surface. So, you know, actually I love the surface quality of, you know, that the washes leave on the paintings. And it's, you know, kind of similar to how I started learning painting where, you know, you start out with like a middle ground and that allows you to kind of see values more accurately. You know, with my painting now, like when I get into that awkward middle stage, doing that destructive wash actually helps me find, you know, figure out the way forward. Again, introducing more problems to solve.
Okay, and I now will start to take questions from the live stream. So Sharon, if you can help sharing those questions.
So we have a question from Michael H. and James, love your work. And they're wondering how do you remain so productive and maintain such high quality and precision? Any advice for perfectionists among us?
Oh, you should definitely not be a perfectionist. That's the worst thing to be because, you know, I make the work and then I push it out there and move on to the next thing. You know, I don't like to get stuck on one project. Yeah, in terms of staying productive, I guess deadlines do help. So, you know, a lot of my work, there are deadlines still. You know, there's deadlines for shows, for, you know, various commercial collaborations, you know, for all my self-imposed print projects and releases and, you know, the various people I work with. There's always, you know, emails and questions and things that come down the pipeline that I have to deal with. But yeah, being a perfectionist is, you know, definitely a hindrance to being productive. So I think that's it.
There is another question.
Sure.
We have a member who is curious about the totem poles in some of the pieces or in the collective piece.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think that was inspired by, so that painting was the first painting I did for this show. And I think that was inspired by, you know, just going through Vancouver and seeing all the totems. And I love indigenous art. I hope it's not cultural appropriation, but, you know, I kind of, you know, absorb influences from all different sources. And but ultimately what unifies everything is that underlying desire to kind of describe the universe, the world around us in, you know, sculpture or you know, even just, you know, drawings on a cave wall. Ultimately, it's all about making our imagination manifest in art. And so for me, that is a cross-cultural thing, and that's why, you know, we have this, you know, these various different cultures in this one painting.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, James. And thank you again for your insightful input. We are at time right now.
But everyone else who is participating in the panel talk, if you're staying for the opening section, you still have more opportunity to chat with James, and you have the opportunity to check out the exhibition as well. So we have the bar serving wines on the second floor, and I hope that everyone enjoyed tonight. Thank you so much.
We did it. We did it.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk. I think everyone enjoyed a lot.
Yeah, my drink is still back there, like I didn't want to start.
椅子说那个那个。
Yeah, that was just the two, sorry.
Oh, okay.